Gargoyles watch with stony gaze, guardians of endless maze. Pipe organ's breath begins to rise, filling air with mournful ties. Whispering shadows secrets keep in the depths where night meets sleep. Underneath the velvet gloom, guardians of the haunted room.
I must have put things in the wrong order. Good afternoon, everybody. It seems I'm making OBS mess-ups once again. Hopefully you guys can hear me. How are we doing today, chat? I've seen most of the usual suspects coming in, which is always a pleasure. Hello, Night Owl. We've got Anura. Baron of Derpshire is here. Brommelstein has made a mistake for the 36th month in a row. Ramshackle and Wilf and Ed, and we also have an Aiden here who I should probably unmute. Hi, Aiden.
Hi. How's it going?
We're here, and we'll see how Chad is doing. Are you sure it isn't OBS causing OBS problems? I mean, that was last week. This week I'm willing to take the blame for it. It was probably me.
Chill, dude.
Ed got his groove back for writing. Tired German's pleased to be here. Well, it's wonderful to see you all. I always appreciate you starting your weekends with us. And we're doing more Shoal stuff this week. More writing, more reading. No arithmetic if I can possibly help it. We are here. I don't have a specific rant ready for this week for you guys. I figured I'd put it over to you folks just a little bit, because all I've had on my mind while writing, let's see, 2,500 words of last week's discussion. All I've had on my mind is tropes and why tropes are good and why tropes are bad. And if you guys would like to talk about some tropes this week, that's kind of where my brain is at.
That's fair, because I admittedly had an idea as well.
What was your idea?
So, you've said repeatedly on stream that there are only 7 archetypes of story in the world.
Yeah, there's
You've
roughly.
never actually gone into detail on what those 7 are.
Yeah, I could probably do that. If people are interested.
I mean, if for nothing else, I'm curious.
Fair. Guy on Broadway says, we're playing Heroes of Might and Magic TTRPG adaptation. We've used several points you get for crit successes to suddenly hire a bunch of goblins out of thin air. We're looking for more ways to hire goblins against everyone else's consent. Our army will be goblins and nobody else gets a say. I approve very strongly, Guy on Broadway, that this sounds brilliant. Ramshackle Salvage, I found a common trope, elves not having beards, like they're genetically set to not have beards. You know whose fault that is? Not intentionally. Tolkien. Tolkien kind of set the standard for what dwarves should look like, what elves should look like, what orcs should look like, and people just seem afraid to deviate from that, though I know Aiden has had some interesting ideas about different kinds of elves and dwarves, and I believe there was redneck elves at one point.
Yeah, I've had some fun ideas with that, largely because in homebrew the idea has been, well, I want to make things not the same old, same old. So how accomplish? How do? Speaking of how do, how, Anka, have you squished the travel crate down like that? You little imp.
She's just
Loot
very, very
Goblin.
good at it.
Loot Goblin Syndicate. Yep, yep. Card carrying member.
I mean, in terms of, I was going to maybe rant about tropes this week. That is a really good sort of introduction to that concept. Tolkien did something so right and that was such excellent literary shorthand for you to understand the story that he wanted you to engage in, that lots of people just sort of accept that as the skeleton of how the world should be, when it's not. It's a series of muscles. The skeleton is having the different races to tell the story in the first place. The fact that they have these particular ways that they work is musculature. It's not your bare basic skeleton. But a lot of people take it as, it must be this. And that's not to say that you can't match what Tolkien did. There's a reason why that literary shorthand works so well. But there's absolutely something to be said for breaking that trope. Because, as anybody who spends any time with any kind of media knows, tropes aren't in themselves a bad thing nor a cliches. They exist for a reason. If they're used well and right at the right time, they can be really, really good. If they're used incorrectly or too often or at the wrong time, they can be really, really bad. As can subverting tropes. That can be really good or it can be really bad.
If the entire identity of the story you're trying to tell is that we exist to do absolutely nothing by trope and undermine every single trope ever, then you're really going to have a very obnoxious story, because that's just being contrarian for contrarianism's
Yeah,
sake.
you'll just
and-
annoy your audience.
yeah.
Will says, to quote Sateri, J.R.R. Tolkien has become a sort of mountain appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears so often in Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close. Sometimes it's a shape on the horizon. Sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist either has made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji. Yes. And then Sateri, being the absolute genius of a man that he was, is getting at the core point of it. There is a story is a constructive narrative. Things in stories mean things. You shouldn't really be putting in extraneous stuff that's not important to the tale that you're there to tell. And it's why you can get away with, suspension of disbelief, bringing in things that wouldn't necessarily be entirely believable in the real world, but you're using shorthand narrative. You're trying to say something with wanting to have an audience look at your work. So it's in your control what goes into that story, what is relevant, what's important, and how you present it. Sometimes that's going to be as a trope, sometimes it's going to be a subverted trope, sometimes it's going to be trying not to have the trope at all or invent a new one. It just needs to be considered. Good writing considers what's being put in.
You heard it here first, folks. Things mean things, according to Lady Red.
Which is also quoting Terry Pratchett.
Indeed.
Esmeralda Weatherwax is known for saying that things mean things.
Things mean things. Unless you're in the squared circle, then nothing means nothing.
You also have things that look like things also look more like things than things do, which is another Weatherwax quote.
There's a lot of things going on here.
I also like Baron of Derpshire's potential isekai title, Redneck Elves and the Swords of Yolad of Ipidov.
I'm sorry. One more time.
Yolad of Ipidov.
I don't think I have enough moonshine in me to understand this strange magic.
You probably don't. I always thought the elves were on the edge of being rednecks. Just dial down the nature loving and you've got heavy rural living elves. I mean, you absolutely can do that, yes. And, one of the other things you have to decide is, how do my elves work, in the same way that you have to consider, how do my zombies work? How do my vampires work? Whatever it is that you're doing. And are they immortal and longer lived? Are they not? Are they shorter lived? One of the interesting things Ivan did with elves in his Pathfinder setting he was running was that due to a curse, they all had incurable wanderlust. Staying in one place just wasn't a thing, and that drastically changed the standard elven culture.
No great elven cities existed because back in the days of great elven cities, their patrons, the Fae, were heavy-handed overlords. The elves finally decided, we can make all this shit without y'all, and said they were going to go their own way. And the Fae are like, oh, bitch, you shouldn't have. And basically said, "All right, because your pride is saying that you can make these fantastic civilizations and cities, guess what? No, you can't ever again. Nor will your children, your children's children, all the way down through the end of time. You will be doomed." And it was a fun little way to set up a reason for why the party paladin, who was a half elf, couldn't just rest on her laurels and base build her little small barony, because she was titled nobility, she was a knight, and to keep the party mobile and adventurous, it was a nice little tie-in because fate would make certain that the curse was enforced, perhaps less heavy-handedly than a full-blooded elf, but the whole gist of it was that, if you start getting too comfortable and resting on your laurels, shit gonna happen. And more and more of this, the reality of this got revealed to the players, I was trying to set up for a long-term, 20th level adventure. We want to have something interesting. We're gonna go punch the literal concept of fate in its stupid, stupid face, because how dare you?
Yeah, punching fate in the face did seem like a fun thing to do in that game. Maybe one day we'll get back to it, because
Maybe.
I also wanted to really go and visit that floating castle that you had in that setting as well.
Indeed. The Fae, the root cause of ADHD. Fact.
To quote the dwarves, fuck the Fae. Correct, tired German. But
We had fun with gnomes, who were a big proponent of fuck the Fae.
Yes, we did have a
because
lot of fun with them.
the gnomes of the Fae-touched Border Wilds were existing purely out of spite for nature, not out of communion with it, and certainly spite for the Fae. They mined iron, wore cold iron trinkets, carried silver bells, salt, and bread in their pockets, and basically just barbarianed their way through existence because the entirety of everything around them wanted to kill them.
It does tend to, sort of put a certain societal pressure on you when everything's trying to kill you. But you did ask a more pointed question for this week about the 7 stories that exist in the world. All right, let's go over those then, because it kind of ties into tropes, especially with certain things overdoing them and some things being very rote and by the book. So you essentially have 7 plots. Most books will fall into one of these 7 plots, or there'll be a variation on it. So the first one that you have is the rags to riches story, which is fairly self-explanatory. You're going to start with a character who is poor and derelict in some way, who over the course of the story and the challenges that they face, will either lose everything and then win it back, or they start from nothing and they win it back, or they have something that they're lacking that they achieve through the course of the story. So they start the story underprivileged in some way, and they end the story through the trials they've overcome with an abundance of whatever that thing is, and they usually get something along the lines of a happily ever after. That's your rags to riches stories. Things that will fall into that, a lot of fairy tales, a lot of stuff that Disney puts out. You get a lot of that sort of stuff coming out at the minute from outside of the Western movie making scene. There's a ton of stuff. I'm sure you guys can think of titles just off the top of your head. I mean, Cinderella is like one of the classics, and Aladdin. You've got all of those sorts of stories fall into that bracket. Second story archetype that you'll get is the questing archetype, where you have a main character. Girls, do you really have to wrestle right now? Quest archetype, where you have a main character or a main party who, for whatever reason, needs to go to a certain location or obtain a certain object or fulfill a specific objective, some quest that they need to go on for some reason, and then you're following them through their obstacles along the way, the trials and challenges they overcome, to eventually succeed in that quest, or if they don't succeed in that quest, they find something else of value along the way, or whatever. You can go all the way back into history with this one. The Odyssey is a quest story. You've got tons of other stuff. We've just been talking about Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is obviously a quest story. Harry Potter books, Wizard of Oz, all of these are different quest stories where you're sending a character or characters off to achieve a thing. Third story archetype will be rebirth. Rebirth stories, quite often you're thinking your sort of religious stories, but it can come in other ways as well. You're looking at a character who starts in one condition and changes their ways and is a better person by the end. You can get quite a few crime stories will turn up in this, redemption stories, underdog stories. These are all sort of rebirth stories. And the classic one there, of course, classic couple would be A Christmas Carol, with effectively the rebirth and redemption of Ebenezer Scrooge. Beauty and the Beast is another classic. Secret Garden, all the sorts of stories where you start with a character who is not necessarily likable or has something about them that it needs to be redeemed, so that by the end of the story you have a satisfying ending where a character has changed in a fundamental way, and the process of how they get there is what makes the story interesting. And these can be quite human stories, especially in the modern day if you're branching outside of strictly religious stories, because, you know, becoming a better person is just part of being alive, and something most people want to aspire to. It is being a good person and having good and healthy relationships with the people around you that you love and care about. So they can be very sort of touching stories. On the sort of parallel to that, but very similar in some ways, you get the overcoming the monster stories. This is the fourth archetype. And overcoming the monster difference from rebirth is the monster tends to be an external factor in this one. So you're not necessarily digging into that human concept of self-betterment and being the most that you can be and how you get there. But some external thing that needs to be overcome. Going back into history, you've got Beowulf, David and Goliath, all of those sorts of things. Dracula is an overcoming the monster story. All of these stories where you are looking at characters who have an external threat that they need to grow and improve to overcome, or the indomitability of the human spirit to overcome an external problem. Star Wars, Terminator, all of these will be overcoming the monster stories. Your fifth archetype are comedy stories. Comedy just gets its own bracket because it's its own unique thing. The important thing to remember with comedy is that good comedy subverts expectation. That's where comedy really stems from. A simple joke might not go that far, but for something to be sort of funny and comedic and have a long-term amusing impact, it tends to be a subversion of expectations, quite often with some absurdity thrown in on top. Going with classics, you've got Midsummer Night's Dream, and then of course you see a lot of it these days with TV. You get sitcoms, for example, are obviously going to fall into this. The Office, you've got all your comedic archetypes going on in that. So comedy stories just get their own bracket. Similarly, your sixth archetype is the tragic story, which is literally comedy but the other side. And there's a reason why in drama you've got, you know, the comedic face and the sad face. These things just get their two own archetypes. A tragedy is a story where you are watching a protagonist or a series of protagonists come undone due to some character flaw that they have, some fateful thing that's going to happen to them that can't be stopped. There's a lot of Shakespeare that plays on tragedies. Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, Romeo and Juliet. And then, of course, you've got more sort of modern stuff where tragedy happens. And you've got the classical world tragedy. A lot of Greek myth is based in tragedy. Tragedy stories I always find kind of difficult. There is a lot of the human condition in them. They can be very compelling, but it's very easy to make them just too much despair. And I can understand it back in the ancient times when you didn't understand how the world worked as well as we do now. Science wasn't as far along, and finding ways to accept cruelties of life that you couldn't do anything about, especially when we didn't understand how sickness works or natural disasters or things like that. Having stories that you could empathize with when life was a lot more tragic than perhaps it is today certainly makes sense, but I struggle with things that have nihilistic endings or depressing endings. I feel like a good story should always have some degree of satisfaction built into it, and tragedy stories don't tend to be built that way. But there are some that I enjoy. I'm a particular fan of the Gaunt's Ghost series, at least the early books, and there's a hell of a lot of tragedy that happens in those, but I find them very compelling, so... that's your 6th type, is tragedy. And then the final one, your 7th archetype that most stories will fall into, if it's not one of the other 6, is the voyage and return archetype. This is where you send people out and then they come back. And you're looking at a protagonist who's gone to a strange place, and through the trials and tribulations or wherever it is that they went to, whether it's a physical place or something else, they come back changed and armed with new wisdom and new experience. So The Hobbit is a good example of that. The reason why The Lord of the Rings does not fit into this category is because although Frodo returns to the Shire, he does then leave the Shire because he is affected by the wraith at Weathertop, and he can't return to his normal life with a new perspective. He moves on. If the story was Samwise Gamgee focused, it would be a voyage and return. But The Hobbit is a voyage and return story. Alice in Wonderland, Chronicles of Narnia, these are all voyage and return stories. Those are your 7 archetypes.
So, in those descriptions, I find that there are some stories that would be a mixture of.
Yes, you can absolutely mix and match, but again, these are archetypes. It's not that you must narrowly constrain yourself into this one bracket and never ever deviate outside of it. It's just that if you go through and classify all stories from human history, they're probably going to fall into one of those 7 predominantly. And what makes a good story and an interesting story and stories that are being, that are worthwhile is the unique factors that you build in with it. Because if you were just telling the same story over and over and over, I mean, after 7 books, that's it. Literature is done. But that's obviously not... you are right, Samwise travels to the west in the appendices, Wilf. You're quite right. But we're pretending not the appendices. But yeah, what makes all books interesting is although you can fit them into these categories, you can sort of pigeonhole which of these 7 a book might belong in, it's still going to be radically different to the book that it's sitting next to in that same category. Because a good story, a worthwhile story that's been put out there is going to be filtered through the life experience, personal preferences, and importances of the author who wrote it. Whenever we're writing, we are filtering our perception of the world into that message we're trying to deliver to other people. And that's what makes it compelling and interesting. No 2 stories will ever be the same, even though you can put them into similar boxes. And it is, of course, bringing us back to the whole thing that I've had tropes on my mind for the last week, is it's why you have to be careful with tropes and cliches. My mind hasn't retained all 7 story types. What are anthologies? Episodic stories. An anthology will tend to be a collection of smaller, shorter stories that usually are all in a similar thing. So an anthology isn't a story type. It was just Wilf mentioning the Lord of the Rings. Appendices was what he was mentioning there. So if it was that you're referring to. If you just mean anthologies in general, an anthology will be a collection of short stories. It might be an anthology of stories in one universe, or an anthology of stories all about a certain topic, or all by the same author, and that's how you sort of collect them together. And each one will probably fit into one of the 7 archetypes. Some stories combine more than one basic type. Yes, absolutely. As I was saying, it's not that, once you choose what your main story is going to be, you must stay narrowly constrained within that box and can never borrow from outside. Absolutely not. You can obviously build in elements of other ones. You can have a story where the primary point of the story is that you are sending a hero off on a quest, but it can also be comedic. And if the quest is, the predominant thing and the comedy is sort of a sidebar to it, you're going to put it into the quest box, but it's clearly heavily drawing from the comedy box at the same time.
AKA Fallout 1 played with low intelligence.
Yeah. There's Love, Death and Robots, where anthologies were mostly none of them connect. I'm not familiar with that anthology to be able to comment, but yeah, this sort of brings us back to the only true rule of writing. All rules are there to be broken if it's in service to your story. None of the rules of writing are so solid and immutable. It's not like gravity. Gravity always works. Laws in writing, you can break them. It's just that you should really consider breaking them before you do.
Yes. The difference between natural law and social law.
Yes. Yes. Most rules in writing are there to be a foundational suggestion. But if your story or your point or your theme or something that you are trying to put out into the world has a really good reason for you to not follow that rule, don't follow that rule. One of my biggest pet peeves with writing advice online, whether it's on YouTube or blog sites or whatever, is that you'll see a lot of these things of 10 writing tips you must avoid, 10 writing skills you must incorporate. No, you mustn't. Here is a list of 10 things that you might want to avoid. Here is a list of 10 things that you should strongly consider. But none of these rules are so indelible that you cannot break them if there's a reason to do so. Fair enough, Ramshackle. Fair enough. So that brings us back to tropes and cliches, as I said. Tropes and cliches can be useful in writing. There are times you should avoid them, times you should use them. The ultimate question that you're always asking yourself as a writer is, does this serve the story that I'm trying to put into the world? And when you're figuring out what serves the story is, for me, I always start with, what is the message that I'm trying to send? Why am I writing this thing for people beyond myself? I've got an awful lot of writing that I've done that is not designed for anybody other than myself to see. And I don't put nearly as much effort into thinking about, what my theme is or what the writing should be or whatever, because I'm writing just to me. But the moment I sit down to start constructing something where I want somebody else's time or their attention or their input or their feedback, it's at that point that I'm thinking about, well, what is the point of this thing that I'm making? Which ultimately will come down to message. What is the message? Why did I want to write my trilogy that I have in the works? Well, one, because I'm absolutely fascinated by volcanology and I want to pass some of that love on to other people. Two, I've got opinions about the concept of power and, Mother Nature's power, societal power, the expectations we put on each other, giving and taking of power, and what that means on a human level. And that's really what my trilogy is about, which is why I ultimately decided the trilogy as a whole would be called the Meaning of Power trilogy. That's the ultimate message that I'm digging into, is what it means to be powerful or powerless. The power of love is not a strong thing in my trilogy, Baron of Derpshire, though there is an undertone of that, because connections and love, whether it's familial love or romantic love, is a part of being alive, and something that I think most books should at least touch on at some point. People should always have a reason to care about other people in most stories. I'm sure there's a few out there that don't have that in them, but that's one of the things that can lead to a bad story is, oh, well, romance books are always terrible, so I'm going to absolutely avoid relationships at all in my story, never going to talk about it ever. Well, you start running the risk of, because you're avoiding the relationship tropes and cliches and all the bad writing that can come out of the romance genre, you end up writing a book that doesn't feel quite human, because relationships and all of that is part of being alive. It's part of what brings us here. Ramshackle says, here's a trope I'm personally tired of, a MacGuffin in the first book that was forgotten for a solid 4 books, and then in the last book it turns out to be a super powerful relic. Yes, that is... What you've got there is... The MacGuffin is not a bad trope. MacGuffins are really, really good if they're used correctly. What you've got there is a lazy writer. You've got a writer who has established something... then they've just gotten distracted by a squirrel and gone off on complete other tangents and forgotten that this arc exists, and then they've written themselves into a corner by the last book, and it's a convenient way to get out of that. That's just lazy writing.
Man, I have opinions on this one.
Go for it.
So there's a game trilogy that 2/3 of I am extremely, extremely fond of. Folks might have heard me discuss it previously with Rail. I know Zayaku played I think, first 2 on stream at one point a couple years ago. Golden Sun. Now, Golden Sun 1 and 2 were originally meant to be one game. It got split into 2, but they are phenomenal, phenomenal stories that have a interesting cast of characters, and it very tightly ties everything all together. All of the things that they hint at the very beginning of the first game pays off somewhere in the story, even all the way to the very, very end, where the final encounter has a reveal that is drawing straight from the very start of the game, of the story, and you're like, huh. Then they released the third game, and that's where it all fell the hell apart. And the reason this prompted me to segue into this is the start of the third game, there's this thing that's happening, these bad things are occurring, rifts are opening up in the world that are like consuming surrounding countryside and generally spewing out monsters and bad crap. And your initial plot hook is you need to go and get a thing that you broke on accident fixed to support because you're playing the children of the original cast, to support their parents in figuring out what's going on with these rifts and do something about it. And there's the prediction that there's going to be a really stonking huge one, and it's going to be fucking awful. It's the looming doom for this story. You wander off to go start doing the thing, and then you get sidetracked, and then a completely different story happens that has nothing to do with anything you were set out to do within the first hour or so of gameplay. First couple hours even, potentially, if you're exploring and not just beelining through the plot. And then when you finish all of this side ancillary stuff that becomes a whole quest in and of itself with its own stakes, its own doomsday scenario that you prevent, and so on and so forth, you come back home finally with the thing in tow that you left to fix in the first place, that you got fixed very early on, but you were so sidetracked with other bullshit that, you don't go back. And oh look, the big rift just opened up, and oh shit, we completely forgot that was even a thing for about 90% of the runtime of the story. Like, this was hinted at being a super bad occurrence that was coming, and we just forgot about it because other shit. And then they just kind of throw hey, surprise, remember this? And then cut to credits, with the implication that there would be a sequel, but it's like, this is so ham-handed. This isn't Chekhov's gun. This is Chekhov's brick to the side of my head.
Yeah, the plot saw a squirrel and just went off elsewhere, and that was that. And you're expected to think that that's good storytelling. It's not. It's very, very lazy. And yes, problematic, because you're not invested now. You started out doing one thing, you don't get the choice whether the characters actually pay attention to it or not, and then you're clubbed over the head about it at the end. You've taken any sense of meaningful stakes away from the player, as well as any agency. Why should you care at that point?
As opposed to the first 2 games where there's a whole world of side shit and distractions that you get pulled into, but at no point do the characters ever not undertake all of the ancillary quests and side things without it being in the context of, we're doing this, but we have not forgotten our primary goal, the overarching goal of the story of the quest, and all the side shit we're doing is either because we're good people helping folks in need, or what we're doing is going to further our ability to complete the main quest. So that always ties in, and you're never just kind of dawdling about and no longer caring about something that's supposed to be really important but is given no importance.
Baron of Derpshire has just brought up another thing that's really relevant to that and ties into what you're saying. He's saying, got the thing, then got sidetracked. So all of my runs in Skyrim/Fallout. So there's a really interesting mod for Skyrim that I think makes Skyrim immeasurably better. It is a mod that allows you to set how many days until Alduin destroys the world. You can do whatever you want within that time period, but for whatever day it is you've set it that Alduin will destroy the world, if you have not completed the main quest by then, Alduin destroys the world, game over. So it gives you an incentive to plan, what side quests you're going to do, what's important when, what do you need to deal with the main story. And of course, with the knowledge that once you've dealt with Alduin, the game continues. You can still do all of the content of the game later on. It's still going to be there. And it's that next sort of little level of suspension of disbelief, because Alduin is coming. You need to do something about it. So I particularly like that mod, and I've recently installed and been playing, at least until the new V Rising update came out. I was playing Oblivion Remastered because Bethesda succeeded in its efforts to sell games based purely on nostalgia, because I remember playing original Oblivion and had a lot of fun with it. And Oblivion, I don't care that it's a janky mess. It's really inexcusable that Bethesda games are as buggy as they are, but with Oblivion, because I am old and I remember playing the original and I had a lot of fun.
You are not old.
The bugs really are a feature, so I haven't really minded that Oblivion Remastered is not a good remaster. It really, really isn't. So I've been playing through that, and because I've been playing through that, I've been looking at some things online and reliving the heyday of that fun game, and a lot of the story that it had, which the Dark Brotherhood questline and the Thieves Guild as well. I really like Thieves Guild in Skyrim, but Thieves Guild in Oblivion is also really good, and Dark Brotherhood in Oblivion is way better than in Skyrim, in my opinion. So, I've been reliving all of those old quest chains and the like, and I came across somebody's post who was talking about how they liked to play Oblivion, and how sort of into character they got with it to make the stakes mean something. Because what they would do is they would focus on the main quest primarily, where they would meet Martin and he'd become a friend and the person they're questing with to save the world. And spoilers for Oblivion. If you don't want spoilers for this over 20-year-old game, now's the time to click off. Oblivion spoilers incoming. Martin dies at the end of the quest line. So what he would do is he'd play the main quest line.
What's that? Steam Bean dies at the end?
I know, shocking.
Say it ain't so.
Shocking, isn't it? So, Martin dies at the end. So his way of playing it was, I play the main quest line with my character becoming friends with Martin, seeing his heroic sacrifice, and he dies, which leads to my character then having a bit of a downfall in life and doing the Thieves Guild quest and the Dark Brotherhood quests because he's depressed and the world isn't fair. And then the Knights of the Nine is his character going through the redemption quest, to becoming back to being a good person. And then he does the Shivering Isles content. So the direction that he chooses to do things is very character driven and makes sense and makes an overall narrative with a really good progression. And that's the sort of thing that, if you're going to be putting a game that's more, or a story or a narrative that's more dictated than something that's as free roaming and open world as a Bethesda game, that's what you should be aiming for, is what is the progression of the character? What does it mean to the audience? So that you're not doing these things where it's like, oh yes, you're off on this quest, except, now we saw a squirrel and we've forgotten about it. Oh crap, we're at the end of the story and there's no stakes and we might want to do a sequel. That thing we completely forgot about from the beginning, it's back now.
And everything you just described about that one person's playthrough of Oblivion is why I love Morrowind, at least from a narrative perspective, because it basically goes, you've been released into this dude's care, and he's like, look, this is what I know, but until you get something of a rep, you're not going to really be able to do much. And then it basically lets you decide what you care about. And unlike the follow on games, you cannot do everything because some of the guilds are at each other's throats. There's mutually exclusive content. And it's all character driven about what you personally feel is interesting to explore and do and what you want to accomplish. At which point, it puts all agency into your hands by not trying to harp on the doom is coming, nah, unless you actively seek out the information to be aware of that. It's not, you're not thrown on the grand quest from the get go. You basically figure out what grand quest you want to take and follow through based on your own interests and intuition, which for a wide open sandbox is a fantastic way to do things because it means that your decisions mean something.
Can be a fantastic way to do things.
It
Don't
can
get me
also be
wrong.
lazy.
Morrowind is brilliant. This would be a whole other discussion all its own that goes into a lot of game design and the intentions of what you're doing with an audience. Morrowind is great. There's an absolute ton to praise about it. But I do think there's also a lot to be said about why things aren't always done in that style anymore. That is a very detailed and complex conversation. But in terms of pure narrative, you're right.
Yeah, and that's why I'm saying from a narrative perspective, I put a lot of praise to Morrowind. But the other thing about it, and this is the real clincher here, is it is supremely hard to do that and not make it just feel like a jumbled mess with no stakes and no buy-in from the player. You have to still give enough curation to the experience to make somebody actually care, rather than just kind of doing, say, the Fable thing and like, I'm just going to go chop wood to make money for the next 3 real-world hours because that's what I need to do to be able to do the thing. I mean, Fable attempted to do similar to what Morrowind did and did it worse by a large margin.
Molyneux syndrome. Another long and detailed conversation that we will have to reserve for another day.
Correct.
Okay, are there any other particular tropes you guys want to discuss before we move over to Shoal? Because I do really want to review the stuff that we looked at last week. So I don't want to get too deep into the extraneous conversations that we've meandered towards, because I know what we will run over, and I really do want to make sure we do some Shoal focus this week.
On the subject of video game tropes, goddamn bats!
Indeed, goddamn bats. Too deep in the seaweeds? Yes. Yeah, we don't want to get too deep in the seaweeds. Forge crabs ho? Yes. If I'm entirely honest with you, introspective, that was what got me started on thinking about tropes this week in the first place. After last week's technology discussion over in the Orcs channel, people were talking about, I think it was Zork and some of the others were talking about the ceratinoid species that we have and alien culture. Oh, it was you? Okay, and I apologise for attributing things to different people, but the mention came up of, crabs potentially having a very different value on bodily harm, among other things, than the other species might have, because potentially for our crabs, if they lose a limb, they can regrow it. So if you're living in a culture and environment where losing a limb isn't in itself, this horrific thing where you don't have a limb anymore, it's going to grow back, and where perhaps your work output is your societal value for a variety of reasons, you get into the thing of, okay, well, you've done something you really shouldn't have. You stole some workman's tools, you committed a crime. Well, you're going to have your hand cut off. But you're going to regenerate it, and the real punishment there is, one, the pain of having it cut off, but two, that your work productivity is going to go down for the duration it takes for that to be there. There was also the talk about, having a larger clutch size than perhaps, humans do and some of the other species. So if you're having a lot of children, perhaps the value that you put on each individual life is a bit different to other species. And that got me thinking about one of the tropes.
Crab OSHA has to be fucking weird.
Yes, crab OSHA will be very weird, but it got me thinking about one of the tropes you sometimes see in stories that really annoys me, and it is this concept that disabled people are either to be over-venerated or over-castigated. There's a lot of media out there where because somebody is disabled, they become a supervillain, or because somebody is disabled, their quality of life is not the same as other people, which absolutely there is stories to be told there, but it shouldn't be every story. And I don't like the concept that disabled people can't have whole and fulfilling lives, and there's always something that needs to be fixed or paid attention to, or some unfairness. And I'm absolutely not trying to say that, you know, there's not sympathy to be given out there, there's not extra challenges that people have to come through. Part of this is possibly coming from growing up the way that I have in my life. At the risk of, you know, getting into a little bit of personal stuff here, my mother is a type 1 diabetic, has been since she was 8 years old. So when I was growing up, because my mother handled her condition so well, I had no idea that it wasn't normal for every mother to have syringes of insulin in the fridge. The smell of insulin is something that I can detect very easily to this day because I grew up around it, because my mum was a type 1 diabetic. But it stopped my mum from doing nothing. Yes, she'd have hypos periodically, and you know that was a medical thing that needed dealing with, and type 1 diabetes, depending on how well controlled and what your access to medical technology is, it doesn't have to be a big disability. But you know, my mum's had challenges through her whole life, but they haven't ever restricted her life, and she's far from had a lesser life because of it. And I don't think she needs to become the CEO of a evil villain pharmacy company as a result of it. So it was us talking about crabs and the like, and willful disability and all these other things that got me thinking about tropes in the first place, and that sometimes they can be used to push a message and talk about something that's meaningful to you, and off you go. And sometimes they can be used really poorly, to the point where even if you're trying to say something positive, you're actually saying something negative about the thing. And of course, that also leads into not researching the thing that you want to talk about if you're not personally familiar with it, and all of these other things that can be issues in writing. So there you go. There's my just off the cuff red rant for the week. Is apply your tropes carefully, especially when it comes to people with disabilities. Introspective says, I pictured the forge crabs as being incredibly logistically and craftsmanship focused, due to both needing to keep track of food and supplies, since their clutches are so big that even with die-off in infancy, there's a lot of crabs wandering around. Yep. There needs to be some fine-tuning between K selection, nurturing and low birth count, and R selection, survival of the fittest and high birth count. Yeah, I do think we need to sort of do a second pass on our races, which we should do right before we get into looking into defining our individual cultures. I was sad once trope that's become more common as of late. Yeah. There's a lot of tropes, and this is the thing with tropes and cliches, is they become prevalent for a reason, and then they get overused, so they sort of go through phases, and then they fall out of favour only to come back again, you know, a decade later or whatever. The one that I always go back to with this, which is, you know, not a in-universe trope, but a sort of fourth wall trope, is prologues. Prologues were so overused and used incorrectly that they fell out of fashion, and it was just the biggest no-no to use a prologue. And now they're kind of in the phase of coming back and being a thing. And currently, most people seem to be using them correctly, but you know, it's going to come and go. It's a bit of a pendulum. How much of that is the dog shit isekai genre? Isekai is the current trash bin of storytelling at the moment. It's very easy to churn out isekai stories. It's very easy to play into power fantasies without putting in much effort. And as a result, you get a lot of stories that don't mean anything, don't go anywhere, and are just... I have opinions on the isekai genre. However, when I find a good isekai, I really enjoy them. Were you going to say something, Ivan?
Yeah, I was gonna make the observation. just because I don't want the thought to go away about the need to balance the K selection and R selection that Tired German is talking about the ceratinoids teaching their younglings how the tech works, the nurturing low birth count versus survival of the fittest and high birth count. And I had a idea about that. Have a very high mortality rate in the very early years, high infancy mortality rate, or something equivalent to that. And basically, the education system waits until they're almost the equivalent to a early teenager to really kick off. At which point, then it is very invested in making the survivors highly trained and highly knowledgeable, etc., etc. Retain the high birth count bit, and then move forward with a very survival of the fittest mindset that evolves into a very nurturing mindset. We don't get attached to you little shits until you're old enough to be able to go out on your own kind of mindset. At which point we become very attached.
Wilf, that sounds absolutely fascinating. Wilf is talking about The Algebrist by Ian Banks. It has an extremely long-lived and free-breeding alien species in it that holds their own young in total contempt, even hunting them for sport. They regard it as being a virtue and making the young grow up tough. They have little regard for the value of life. I don't want to go quite that far in Shoal because we've got a certain, I won't say an optimistic tone, but we've been very even-handed with the tone in the book. That book that you're describing sounds fascinating. I probably really enjoy reading it, and I think that's a great exploration to have. I don't know that we want to go that far in Shoal, but I do also agree with the idea of having this race that is different in terms of they do have more young, and how that affects their culture. And I think that would be really interesting to discuss once we really get into that. Reminds me of the old 100-day rule for newborns. Don't name them until they survive 100 days. Yeah, because, emotional investment can be exhausting. And, of course, resource investment is something that you really have to manage. So it will be really interesting to extrapolate out how we deal with the cultures of our different ceratinoids. And we always have the ability, because we've got our deep water ceratinoids, we've got our shallow water ceratinoids, and we can have different cultures within those two groups as well, where perhaps, they do things differently. And it gives us a lot of scope for you guys to have a lot of input on what you think should happen where. And we'll find that nice even ground to give us lots of playroom. What Aiden is describing reminds me of the coming of age ceremony many societies have to tell the 14-year-olds that they are now teenagers with some responsibilities. Yes, though, let's try not using the ants thing that certain tribes still out there in the world do.
Yeah,
Oh,
the
God!
bullet ants?
Yeah, the bullet
Bullet
ants.
ants. No! Why?
But yeah, that's all going to be culture stuff, which I do want to get to within the next sort of couple of weeks. What I'd really like to do today for our Shoal segment, as we are now hitting Shoal time, I'd like to go over everything we discussed last week to see if I've written it up in the way that you guys envisioned and make sure that's all good. And then I'd like to talk about Titan tech and what our first Titans would have been, how we went from, fulfilling a need that the Shoaly would have had to what we now have, so that we can start sort of putting all of that together. And I do also have some stuff from the auxiliary Discord channel that I would like to read on stream as well, because once again, you guys have been awesome and doing really cool things this week. And then if we still have time at the end, I've made some new stuff for WBPLW if you guys want a preview.
So I'm looking at the bit from Bully Snake here, surviving first molt as a threshold. What if we're looking at a two-stage sort of life cycle where they begin life in a larval stage, and it's when they basically emerge from their larval stage to full bore, shelled, multi-limbed crabmen, instead of being little wiggly kind of half worm, half crab, that they hit the point of, okay, cool, you're one of the big kids now, and now we put a lot more investment into your longevity.
So first molt would also be a metamorphosis, and that's why it's so risky compared to future molts.
That's my thought. Yeah.
Okay, Sarah's just laid on my keyboard, so I'm currently having to reset Twitch so I can see chat. Thank you, Sarah. Very helpful, baby girl. Yeah, I like the idea of that. That sounds really interesting. Chrysalid state that does not succeed in huge amounts. Yeah, that could really fit in with our, our sort of tone that we have. First Malt also runs the risk of them just imploding from water pressure. Oh boy.
Oh boy.
Transference from soft shell to hard shell. Okay, yeah, this sounds like a really good idea. Right, let me pop over to our ceratinoids then, so I can make that note in there for when we do our review of our races. Okay, ceratinoids are here. Okay, I'm going to put this right at the top as a big old chat note. Large clutch sizes. I also need this to not be in heading and to just be normal verse, please. There we go. And it doesn't need to be bold and underlined. Okay. Large clutch sizes, high infant mortality, start in a larval stage when first molt happens. Many do not survive. Those that do are then entered into the education system. Ceratinoids have a bit of a different approach to corporal punishment than other races. They can regrow lost limbs. There we go. Then I will be able to put that back in when we sort of review through our races, because I do think we're going to need to do that as we move into culture, which will be very, very soon. Right, let's see. I really want to include the fact that crabs are typically opportunistic omnivores. Yeah, we can certainly put that in as well. Where did I put? They are also opportunistic omnivores.
Finding the sandwich somebody left on the pavement is not necessarily a problem. They're like, oh, hey, snack.
Very different to most races. There we go. All right, what else do we have from chat? Soft-shelled and easy prey, more survivable after first molt. Okay, so we want to make the larval form soft-shelled.
Seems reasonable.
So in a soft-shelled larval stage. Okay.
I would also like to make the observation that this is making me think of a very famous and very well-written story, actually, as far as a description to just kind of how the ceratinoids would look at mortality, even based on the nature of their youth. So in Shogun, there is a point where John Blackthorne, the character that the majority of the story is following, he's kind of the lens through which you see the setting. One moment. All right, anywho. Pip yelling about random knocking noises that aren't random because it's his mother. So John Blackthorne is speaking to some of the native Japanese people that he has fallen in with. I think in this case, it's the female lead whose name is Mariko.
Mariko, yes, Mariko-san.
Yeah, so he's talking to her and he's making the observation that life is supremely cheap in Japan. He's seen people willingly throw their lives away, even to the point of seppuku. They have extreme stoic gusto about doing things that will result in fatalities. And he's like, this is completely unreasonable and alien. from where he's coming from in England, where the idea of seppuku is basically saying, yes, I want a one-way ticket to hell because that is what the faith of his homeland preached. At which point she makes the observation that because of all of the environmental pressures, earthquakes, typhoons, the fact that fire is so dangerous, the reason they build largely out of easily replaced but not too sturdy materials is because they could build with sturdier stuff, but then the typhoon would blow it over anyway. So making these tinderbox villages made out of paper and wood makes sense when you realize that it's not going to change the outcome, and that people are going to die very regularly, very abruptly anyway. So their culture adopted this very easy come, easy go mindset, which is where they segue into kind of explaining the concept of karma. I'm wondering if a similar karmic concept would apply to the ceratinoids, where the easy come, easy go nature of their adolescence before they metamorphosize kind of not just affects their ideas about corporal punishment because, oh, look, I can just regrow that claw, but it's embarrassing, painful, and frustrating because of the lost productivity. But also, they have a much more stoic outlook to mortality, and by extension, that means that the Titan pilots, the combat Titan pilots among the ceratinoids, would be particularly terrifying if for no other reason than they will very gladly fight in situations that has high mortality risk because it would just be my time. That's my karma that I die here today.
You've also got the more sort of positive side of that comes from a different saying that exists in the world. And it's one of the things that I find incredible about humanity when we're at our best. And I always feel that stories allow us to explore the human condition, even ones set in weird worlds like Shoal that we're making. And there is a saying, and something that I think is great in humanity, that we are remarkable because as individuals, we will plant trees for our children whose shade we will never enjoy ourselves. The tree that we plant today will shade our children generations from now. And I would be down for the ceratinoids having that kind of sort of, or at least one group of them, because again, we can have multiple cultures within a race. But to have that idea of it's okay for me to die now to this greater good, or for something I'm doing now to be detrimental to me because it's going to be beneficial for those who come after. If I die here today, that's fine. My knowledge goes into this Titan. I'll have protected this issue so that the children who survive till tomorrow benefit from my sacrifice today. For the grand clutch. Yeah, I think that would be and that would help us again to keep that.
Yeah.
It's not, I wouldn't call Shoal optimistic, but we do have a certain positive trend of something that's being striven for that I desperately don't want to lose, because there's a
Yeah.
lot of sad, serious, realistic literature out there at the minute. And I'd like Shoal to feel a niche that perhaps isn't always filled by other mecha-based setting. Once we have I'm not saying that doesn't exist. It's just this is the tone that I'd like Shoal to try and
Yeah.
embody.
And I'm what I was gonna say is in support of that because just I would even say that that's still a very realistic way of looking at it because when you look at the development of many of the great civilizations, yes, there's the tragedies and the cruelties involved in them, but at the same time, look at the capacity for people to come together for a far, far greater purpose and good. And you can track that in the rise of many different nations, groups, empires. I mean, hell, look at the space race of all things. Or look at in World War II when the armies of the Nazis started steamrolling Europe, and look at the culture shift of self-sacrifice that the American people adopted to granted, a large part of it is very propaganda driven, but it was a very cultural thing that I suffer hardship now that freedom may ring. And it's like you said, humanity at its very greatest. I don't see why that wouldn't be a very realistic thing to be able to capture, and for a society to then be able to attain its pinnacle requires a very uplifting and positive message in a lot of ways, even if it's one that's steeped in a very alien perspective, like very stoic crabmen going, "If I die, I die." But I, for the grand clutch, as it was said.
Yes, I really like that for the Grand Clutch. That's great. Also, we now have a Lictor. Hi, Lictor. How are you?
Hurrah!
I am wonderful. How are you guys?
Doing good, doing good. We have, as usual, started without quite a clue of where we were going and ended up deep in the weeds talking about interesting stuff. So, normal week on Shoal.
I will point out that the sentence about it's a Roman saying, I think it was Cicero, that went about the greatest honor a man can have is to plant trees that only his children will enjoy.
That's it. That's the
So-
original. See, I knew somebody would know where it came from. I just remembered the point.
The point stands. The court recognizes the point.
All right.
Um,
So we've been over that.
yeah.
I think the best thing to do from here is I really want to read you guys what I wrote based on everything we discussed last week to make sure I got it right. And you guys can let me know anything that I got wrong or need to correct or need to add. And then I really want to talk about how we will have gotten to the point of our Titans, because I think that's a significant thing we need to then be able to finally move into culture and continuing on from there. So if that's okay with you guys, I'm going to do a bit of reading and you guys will give me your feedback.
Send it.
Okay. So let's make this my only screen at the minute so it's easier to read. So last week we talked about technology. Technology on Shoal developed to meet the unique needs of its peoples, yet despite these different challenges, there are also mirrors to technology on Earth. Birth of technology. Alike to humans, Shoaly species began their quest for technological understanding after developing very basic tool use as their brains developed sapience. Very early Shoaly artifacts are hard to come by due to the weathering nature of water and its salinity, but those that exist, as well as cave carvings, depict fish hunting and carved stone tools. With time, these early artifacts became more refined and uniform, leading into the early ages of technology changing lifestyles and culture. Early technology. Food and shelter are major driving factors for life on Shoal as on Earth, leading to an early technological progression from basic hunting tools and gathering containers to more complex devices and control of local environments. Agriculture formed an early step in technological advancement that shifted Shoaly peoples from roaming to find food to protecting zones which would eventually become settlements. Shoaly agriculture, or aquaculture if we wish to be more accurate, formed around two main loci. First, areas of dense fish population or where fish would travel to spawn. These abundant oceanic areas were settled for ease of access to food and encouraged the concept of cooperation at levels beyond family units. The other main loci for early settlements can be found around cave systems that historically have produced an abundance of edible algae, sea mushrooms, anemones and mollusks. While many of these systems no longer resemble their prehistoric forms, those that do give a clear understanding of how the Shoaly broached the concept of farming. A direct result of... Excuse me, I am choking on air. A direct result of these sedentary behaviours, however, was the birth of conflict on a larger scale, a social pressure which has played a large role on Shoal as it has on Earth. The basis of society. Shoal's people have achieved similar milestones to humans through their development, such as cooking, textiles and ceramics. It is easy to assume that due to the majority underwater existence of Shoal's people as a group, their technology is not as broad or complex as that achieved on Earth, but this is far from the case. Irrespective of the impressive titans, even basic technology on Shoal shows a level of complexity from generations of development and learning. Cooking on Shoal is a smorgasbord of flavours and textures. Naturally, fish make up a large part of shoaly foods, but they also have a wealth of seasoning and spices, edible plants, and preservation technology to expand their menus. Almost everywhere on Shoal, one may find plate corals, a ubiquitous species that produces an edible film used in many shoaly dishes. It would be easy to assume hot food was not something the shoaly developed until they moved onto the scant land masses, but this is not the case. Whether through thermal vents, undersea lava flows, or from cookware situated on surface travelling boats, the people of Shoal learned to cook their food relatively early in their history, though exact dates vary by species. Where heat is not applied to make food easier to digest, it is common to find the use of salts and venoms from Shoal's native species to treat foodstuffs, and the shoaly put a very large emphasis on texture in their cooking, with good plating in the modern day often focusing on the contrast of hard and soft, slippery and rough, rather than colour as is common on Earth. Textiles on Shoal are also prevalent, though not in the way they might be on Earth. While it's possible to find some of the same concerns for clothing and material on the land masses, concepts of cold weather clothing don't really exist on Shoal, at least not until recently with broaches into near space. Shoal's land is temperate, and material underwater does not provide the same breadth of chill resistance as in air. The concept of clothing similar to wetsuits exists, however these can only do but so much. As a result, shoaly clothing tends to be either extremely practical or extremely presentational. Hard-woven clothing with clip points and pockets are not uncommon for everyday wear. Depending on species, these articles may take into account streamlining for easier motion in water or come with woven-in tethers to stay safe in rough currents. Some clothing is also specifically designed to integrate with the body for races such as the ceratinoids. On the other end of the spectrum, clothing may come in very light and shifting forms, designed to display the motion of Shoal's currents or the breeze for those who live on land. It is also not unheard of or frowned upon for shoaly to wear nothing at all, as this is sometimes just the most practical option. Much of Shoal's textile industry exists to make useful tools such as nets and medical supplies. Most is derived, as with clothing, from the wiggleweed, a fibrous plant whose shape causes it to move seemingly counter to the current. Ceramics took longer to fully emerge on Shoal, but have also become a backbone of technology and industry, appearing in multitudinous forms as on Earth. Originally developed in the vast lava tube settlements of the poles, where air is more common alongside easy access to heat, Shoal followed a similar path to Earth with this technological sphere. Pottery provided convenient and valuable storage for homes, ships and trade, with cast glass making an early appearance thanks to serendipitous discoveries from Shoal's volcanic nature. Once land was colonised, ceramics continued to explode in complexity, with a supply network of undersea materials and land-based casting facilities allowing modern shoaly to make very compositionally sound products with minimal impurities, a factor critical in Titan construction. Right, I'm going to take a quick pause and see what chat has to say, and if we're doing okay before I read the next bit. Is anything there incorrect or needs adding to?
There's no reference to color and how it behaves. We are humans. We are human readers. The absence of color can happen as a writing exercise. However, the contrary of color is scent, and underwater scent and pheromones will carry a great deal more.
Okay, would that be something that would be technologically enhanced or something that's just natural to the different races?
We've went into food, flavors, soft and hard, plating.
Yep. I only mentioned that because I felt it would make sense overall to go with texture rather than colour, because of course for our deeper sea species, they're not going to see colour.
Not well, anyway.
No.
Or possibility, they see into different spectrums that are...
That's true. We do have some that we know see into UV.
Which may provide a different and interesting experience and allow us to broach deeper into the things that are unique to our setting.
Okay, so what we're thinking
So,
is with the cooking, we need to take into considerations for smell, including pheromones,
oh yes, and acidity, gastric acids, the same way where you make cheese.
acidity. Cool, because acid does come up in one of the other sections I've written further down, but I hadn't considered it for cooking. Okay, so considerations for smell, including pheromones, acidity, color where applicable, including UV spectrum. And one of the things that I think would be nice to do a bit later on is to maybe do a section specifically on just cooking rather than a technological overview where we go into it in more depth. And that could include talking about regional dishes for each race and things that they value that maybe other races don't. So we might want to dig into cooking much deeper when we're looking at culture as well.
That sounds amazing.
Okay, so I've made those notes. Are there any other notes that we need to add at the minute? I hope I haven't influenced the clothes of Shoal too much in my drawings. I wouldn't say so, Tired German, and your drawings made so much sense for how the characters that you depicted would move. And again, that doesn't have to be representative of every individual of that race. It could be just, from one particular culture. So we can still play with that, and I love your illustrations. They're fantastic.
Agreed.
Okay, Laticals would have more emphasis on colour, yes, and I think that's something that we really need to bring up in their section. Again, this is just a technological overview of the planet as a whole, but yes, we can add these extra things in because I hadn't put much room in for those.
So I want to comment on introspective here. Something I read a little while ago. Mantis shrimp don't actually see more colors than we do. They're just less efficient at blending the colors they perceive together, which is why they need more cones. So it's not that they perceive additional stuff, it's just that they perceive the same amount of stuff on more analog hardware and thus need to mix it in more brute force fashion than the digital lookins peepers of the human, where we can perceive, our brains can mix together the colors we perceive from the more limited sources more efficiently.
The
If
eyeball
that
Mark
makes
1
sense.
is quite cool.
It's
However,
wonderful that we
we
still don't fully understand mantis shrimp, and we keep finding out new things about them all the time, and that they're just these little guys that live underwater, and they're absolutely fascinating.
Well, no, that's kind of why things are fun. No,
Absolutely. Right, okay, so we did ceramics. Okay, I'm going to carry on, and you guys will let me know when I get to the end of the next section, anything we need to add into these as well. Domestication. With fundamental technologies in place and areas of food growth and animal gathering settled, it is inevitable that domestication will follow. Shoal is a notably dangerous world, both in its natural environment and everything that lives within it. Harnessing these forces has seen the Shoal to their greatest successes, starting with domestication of otherwise dangerous species. One of the earliest records of domestication, preserved in both a physical record as well as an ancient spoken Edda, talks of the maiden Gweneda and an ancestral siren eel. Lured by its song, the Ada speaks of Gweneda's efforts to gain the creature's trust and cooperation, with the eel eventually employed to protect her fish flock for her family. To this day, siren eels are a very common herd protector on fish farms, far more intelligent and amenable to the shoalie than their wild counterparts. Many other species have been domesticated over the millennia, from other cooperative relationships to early genetic engineering in terms of line breeding and trait selection for better food stocks. Transport animals, such as the manta ray, followed soon after. Plant domestication took longer on Shoal due to the nature of propagation of underwater plants. However, this too is something that the people of Shoal have taken advantage of for better food and textile crops. Trade and currency. With settlement and need, or abundance, trade is a logical step. Similarly, with areas to defend and protect, peaceful diplomacy to avoid conflict often makes use of trade lanes. Shoal's backbone of trade is the Silver Current, a powerful oceanic motion that circles much of the ocean moon in a fast-moving and consistent loop. It plunges to the depths and up to the surface along its circumference, enabling not only a horizontal flow of goods, services and news, but also from the deeps to the shallows. Early trade began on this current and continues into the modern day as one of the busiest and most protected through routes on all of Shoal, bringing together all of its disparate and unique peoples to exchange goods, ideas, and services. The earliest known trading that still exists in the record talks of early allegiances and dramatic requests sent upstream to avert disaster from famine and sickness. These ancient records are based in barter systems and promises, but also surprisingly with very early currency. Like much on Shoal, this deviation from expectation has a common source: coral. The existence of Temps coral, the coral type which allows psionic impression to be imprinted upon it, seems to have always formed a natural precious item of exchange between Shoalei. Small pieces imprinted with concepts of debt or gratitude or honour appear in the ancient record before modern currency systems took the concept far further. Today, Shoalei have two major currencies in circulation. The most common is the fin, a series of cast obsidian coin values used in basic exchange and banking. An overarching currency of more poignant wealth, however, remains in the form of Temps coral, either as shards or whole tablets. One's wealth on Shoal is intrinsically tied to the memories one stores on new Temps coins or possesses from one's lineage and past. Thus, Shoal's banking system is somewhat unique compared to Earth, as it is not and has never been tied to a gold standard or precious metal stock exchange, but rather to history, knowledge and record keeping. Thus, there is very little distinction on Shoal between a banker and a librarian, with both jobs fulfilled within one building in most cities. Record keeping. Shoal has a very organic and interesting system of record storage and honour for its own past. As stated above, bankers and librarians are often one and the same, with great importance and reverence placed on the storage of knowledge. Perhaps this is not just a result of psionic ability and imprints on Temps coral, but also due to how disparate life on Shoal can be. Both the spoken record and written records for all Shoalei races tend to explode around the time each race encountered its contemporaries. It perhaps is not only a human trait to wish to ensure one's mark on the world and one's culture is remembered. Many are the poems, songs, eddas and choirs of Shoal's past, kept alive and sung by historians who often have accreditations in performing arts also. The written record, however, is a somewhat more nebulous thing as one journeys into the past. It is thought that the very earliest record keeping belongs to the Laticulls, in the form of seashells that used a runic symbol of claw marks to mark messages. To this day, seashells are often used as a Terran might use scrap paper to jot down a quick note or sketch. Following this early broach into the written form, ancient stone carvings from multiple races have been found, with straight runic symbols used by most in order to carve deep into the rock and outlast the weathering of the seas. Almost shrine-like in their placement, the oldest records tend to be found in caves and still water systems where time and tide has had the least effect. Carving became more prevalent and complex after the development of obsidian chisels and cast volcanic tablets, with acid etching following in later centuries as farming of boulderfish became possible. In the modern day, the spoken record continues with theatres in every major settlement. Written records are still inscribed in stone, while also often stored in acid-etched scroll records and papyrus equivalents on land. The most important archives, however, are the coral libraries. Most major cities have several library banks where hosts of Temps coral are stored. Many of these will be inert books of knowledge and thought and emotion inscribed in years past, though some libraries are living libraries, structures built around living coral belonging to the civilization that settled an area. These living libraries embrace new memories as they continue to grow, some preserving records back hundreds and hundreds of years into the past. As a result, Shoalei tend to be much more in tune with their ancestors, as one does not need to imagine what life might have been like or what one's great ancestors might have thought. One can simply go to a living library to step back in time psionically. Library banks also have a rather unique job position: the adventurer librarian. Each archive tends to have several of these on staff whose sole job is to seek out Temps corals of the past, with the ultimate prize, and possibly merely a legend at this juncture, being the discovery of a lost ancient Temps coral inscribed with psionic records of yestercentury. As we know, such a thing would be worth a lot of money. Librarians also tend to make for excellent mech pilots, and it is not uncommon for elder librarians to indeed have titans of their own, or inherit those belonging to the library. Storing stone records, after all, is heavy work. What do we think about that?
I just want to point out the distinction between librarian and priest is non-existent.
Yes.
Just remember that clerk and cleric are the same thing.
Yep.
So perhaps it's not so strange that these people are one and the same.
Yep.
Agreed.
That being said, love it.
Cool.
Let's see what
It's-
Chet has to say.
Yes.
It's a nice synopsis of the extensive discussion we had last week.
I do try to pay attention and write up what you guys tell me. Also, I really like this quote. More things between surface and silt than are dreamt of in your philosophy. That's really good.
Nice.
That is,
Introspective
That is
90,
wonderful.
we have the eternal racist grandpa. Yes, you could just go to the library to find out exactly how much your great-grandfather hated the cephalonoids.
can you blame him? So many tentacles.
Okay, I'm not seeing any queries or problems coming in from chat. Let's go through the next section. All right, forging. Metallurgy is as critical on Shoal as on Earth, but with very different challenges. Depending on the race, the Shoaly people come to forging either late or very late, in no small part due to their underwater environment. It is hard to know exactly when the people of Shoal began to forge metals, but it's very likely the first race to do so was the ceratinoids. Forming settlements around the immense lava tubes at the poles, they were the first in position to take advantage of spaces filled with air in order to make use of fire, heat, and thus smelting. Known today as the Spire Cities, these underwater settlements exploded in size and complexity with the development of metal tools, weapons, and armour. The dominance of these cities only increased once farming of giant jellyfish was achieved, ensuring a consistent supply of oxygen and hydrogen to the lower depths. Today, the Spire Cities are still the preeminent forges on the moon, but the technology developed there is felt across all of Shoal. Similar foundries now exist on land, and after the Great Gloam War, a complex and cooperative trade network sees ore from the very depths of Shoal flow into the foundries and out as everything from nails and foil all the way up to Titan skeletons and space technology. Perhaps of most interest to humans, beyond mining and smithing titans of course, is Shoal's cavitation hammers, handy mining tools even a podland can use to mine ore underwater. As a final note of convergent social evolution, the mine canary seems to have also existed on Shoal. Records exist from ancient ceratinoid ventures into the lava tubes that would form the Spire Cities. While no fluttering canaries exist on Shoal to warn of dangerous gas ahead, it seems the humble ferrofuzz fulfilled this role for the Shoaly. Their shells are known to change colour under certain conditions, and they were used to warn explorers and miners of danger ahead. And that is basically the write-up of everything we did last week. How do we feel about that?
I would like, if it's possible, to discuss an example of how the Shoaly early metallurgy manifested. I mean, there are many things that we don't understand. You can't use a hammer underwater. The water will diffuse surface. You can only. It's much easier to use puncturing devices. You'll have spears, you'll have spears, and you won't have any bows, or nearly no bows.
So this is something that Eric has brought up. We had originally spoken about the Podlands being the first to discover metallurgy when we were still thinking about underwater forging before we realised that it might be easier to solve the problem with lava tubes. And although I feel that Podlands will be ideally situated to acquire ore in the modern era, the reason I wrote it up the way that I did is basically because of what Lichter is talking about. Mining underwater initially with early technology, it's not really going to be a thing, and bog iron is useless to you if you can't smelt it, because bog iron you can just pick up. So my thought is that the lava tubes in areas where they've, penetrated deep enough. It would be the ceratinoids who settled that area that would probably find the first ore that they can easily mine because they're in an air environment, and be able to smelt it because they're in an air environment, and that things started from there. That's where my current thought process is, and I'm very open to people weighing in on that chat, as well as Lictor and Iden.
So I guess big question is, and this is largely because I'm not actually that smart in the myriad ways of metallurgy. What would the potential be for early metallurgy on Shoal to, instead of being through heat forging and smelting, be through chemical refinement? Because I know Lichter brought up some of the possible processes last week in that respect. It wouldn't necessarily allow for ferrous materials based on the, very brief Googling that I was doing over the course of the last couple days, but it would allow for at least some rudimentary metal working that could serve as the initial basis, kind of like how if you look at the idiot's understanding to mankind's technological progression, you go from the Stone Age to copper, bronze, eventually to iron, and then steel, and then, everything beyond that. Also, unrelated entirely, our precious little baby girl is trying to chase something in her sleep. Her little paws keep twitching.
Oh.
Yeah.
I think having the concept of working softer metals underwater in certain ways for some things makes sense, but as Introspective is saying, chemical forging doesn't do well underwater over extended periods of time. And I think sort of the real getting to grips with smelting and forging and refining is going to need to happen in the lava
I,
tubes and
I,
in the air.
Oh
I
God, one of the
have an
dogs
idea.
just gassed me.
I have an idea, and that is, first off, the iron snails, ferrous metals, because rust, iron snails. What I'm thinking is not so much, consider the ferrofuzz. I know I always bring it up, but hear me out. Um, if there is a way to have a ferric fluid, or even a Kipric fluid, copper based fluid, that you then set as a type of an amalgam with biologically made resin, you can kind of make plasteel and skip a lot of the problems because you're molding it instead of forging it. You're creating a mold, everything is heavier than water, so it can all set together like a sort of a metallic epoxy. And
Okay.
that could serve as a basic material. It doesn't have to be as hard as iron or forged steel. Once you know how to make it, and if the ingredients needed to make it are common enough, you can
So
definitely build around it.
perhaps for our deeper water species like the podlands, the deep ceratinoids, the whale people, perhaps that was some of their early technology, that they, figured that out to do some of the earlier technological stuff that might be useful
I mean,
until the trade networks are set up to then make use of the more standard, in inverted commas, forging.
yes, because
Hmm.
once people had the ability to convey knowledge, they started being curious and they started combining things.
Yep.
Just listen to the ways alchemy started in Egypt and Rome and China. And they did some wacky stuff to make weird shit. Like, very weird shit. And if you can figure out how to make cement that's set underwater, I'm looking at you, Romans, by using certain types of sand from certain beaches, you can figure out a way to make a resin that operates well enough for what we used to use lead and tin in the earlier cultures.
Yeah, so that gives us
And
that sort of early step forward until you can then get to the more complex stuff later on.
yes, and it just replaced fire with with acidic treatments and epoxy resin derived from corals, and you can have some very unique and fun stuff to do because then you can decide, okay, what if what we're using is layered resin, layer on layer on layer on layer on layer until you reach the correct strength, tensile strength and sharpness, for instance.
Yeah.
The
That seems
same,
reasonable.
Yeah.
and
It also ties into the more kind of biotech vibe that we've been looking at and working towards.
Yeah, but we still then have our standardized forging for later on to maintain that suspension of disbelief of how the fuck do you have these giant mecha and how can they go off world? Because we do want to do a little bit of that in time, I think. All
we
right.
want a lot of that.
Yeah. Okay, I think this is all making sense. So that takes all of our notes from last week. They still make sense this week with a few things to add in. Perfect. Really, really happy with all of that. Okay, so what I would like us to focus on and add on in our last sort of 20 minutes, half an hour we have this week, let's talk about the Titans for a little bit because we know we've got Titans. We know that they are a complex machine, effectively, because you can't form your first true Titan until you know that coral can allow you to connect, effectively an exoskeleton at the very least, to a pilot. What would the progression of the Titans have been? And I liked the idea we talked about that we would have started off with very practical machinery to become Titans instead of it being born out of conflict and war. So, what do we want to do with Titan development?
I have a slightly messed up idea, but I think it fits the very pragmatic mindset. We've already discussed the ceratinoids having a very interesting outlook on things like corporal punishment. Oh, you stole a thing, off with his claw. Well, it'll grow back, sure. But now that crabman is crippled for his job for a while, and his boss is pissed off about it. What if the initial forays into this were basically in prostheses that allowed corporally punished ceratinoids to continue to function effectively at their employment that the employer kept in their possession for such a circumstance. Yeah, when you go home for the day, you ain't taking it with you because you were punished for a reason. But I've got shit that needs doing. I've got a quota to meet.
We had talked about originally the ceratinoids being the preeminent people for prosthetics and that sort of thing. So personally, I think that makes complete sense, is to start it from there, and perhaps that's where that development began from. However, that's not going to account for all the different types of Titans that will have led to, all the different types of complex machinery that would have led to Titans. So I think that is a good fork that leads us to a Titan.
It at least allows for the potential for interface with exoskeletal support structures that are self-powered.
Yeah. What was your thought, Lictor?
I think I'm going to build on Barono, Derbyshire idea because I think they're correct in their assessment. I think that the first Titans weren't Titans at all. I think that the first Titans were just corals that had the correct amalgam, the correct shape and of brain and memory and muscle corals that have been naturally around, with a Shoal that was attuned well enough to what was going on, and they figured out they can move it. And then they did they didn't first think about locomotion. They thought about, okay, I have a very big machine. I'm going to use that to move other things. They started as sessile. They only figured out moving later. They started as sessile, naturally occurring reefs of coral. And once they figured that one out, they started thinking, okay, if I can move a limb of this thing, can I build a leg?
Oh
Can I
man,
build an arm?
Okay, that's another fork
And
that comes into it. Yeah.
that
it's
means the first person to interface with a Titan, to use the term very loosely, like you are, would be effectively the equivalent of a deep sea botanist who is testing their crackpot theory about why the coral is moving.
yeah.
So literally the initial interface would more have been like a grad student working on their doctorate on the growth and development of natural corals, not an engineer who's trying to make a robot.
You
And this
have
grad student
much.
just scored his fucking life as he just scored all of the fucking wealth in the world because he became remembered forever as the first mech pilot entirely by accident. And I love the idea of accidentally mech.
That is that is my idea. I mean, like, I think that Mech Warrior had a point where it had to be a bunch of technologies that had to be grouped together and figured it out
Yes. Which is why I'm
piecemeal.
interested in these different sort of points that we're bringing, these little different spikes of usefulness that will then all combine together. Eventually, you get a Titan.
So the first thing that everyone would figure out was the linking of different corals together to form a network, because this is how we remember things as colonies already. This is an early point. The linking it to something that can move on its own, and automation, an autonomous, a muscle replicant, comes in later after they figure out basic machinery and operating. Wow, pulleys. Pulleys are hard. Mimicking bones. My heavens. Did they make well, they had to have cranes and stuff because some things are heavy and you can't move them easily. So they had cranes. So they figured that out. They figure musculature. Which part of the coral handles that part?
So ponds corals are the ones that have the linkage that lets you do muscle-like stuff with them. That they allow, psionics to go to. Yes, motion. Temps corals are
No.
memory. Bronze corals
Oh,
are personality.
I think what happened, and this is an event story, not the whole research, but they went in and someone noticed a quiet hitting a coral reef, and they just noticed the palms twitching when the bronze got hit by the quiet. And that led to speculation. It might have been in lore, might have been in many other thoughts. And then when they figured out, wait a second, can we control, and in an attempt to assuage the coral after the quiet went away, they figured out they can move the palms by interacting with the bronze and the temps coral. And this is where the first idea of moving coral through synthesis interaction, like, it's in the wake of an attack they noticed something else causing the coral to twitch and move, and this provided the inspiration. See what I mean?
Yes, yes, I'm typing as you're speaking. Because
Okay.
good thoughts.
Okay. Good thoughts are good. Hmm. Yes, ropes. We need ropes. There will be lots and lots of ropes, and they're conductive, and ropes that are conductive to psionic interaction. So not ropes, strings, taut strings that can carry vibrations, that can carry music. I'm
That'll...
ripping off tired German here.
Crazy for human way thinking the pond's corals will be first be contracted. Yes. We've seen different use in your the idea of titans being greater shells for crabs came about. Yeah, I think with the ceratinoids playing around with prostheses, that sort of thing of, connecting a system just to yourself, they're the sort of species that would do that.
I
Titan
won't see
starting
it
off
as
as cross
any
between a
sort of
squid and a
problem.
cargo submarine, and then skeletons coming into it once surface exploration started. Yeah, and I think getting to the concept of a Titan is going to be a little bit different for each race. Certain discoveries will be shared between them, but then the application of those discoveries will be different for the needs of each race. That then eventually leads to just Titans happening in different ways. And I think, you're going to initially get that as just individual limbs with the ceratinoids, but maybe for the laticoles, it will be a hauling machine first because of their penchant for breaching the surface and living on land and needing that transitional cargo technology where they can't just rely on, manta rays or whatever to haul everything for them. The needs will be different, but you're all going to end up with, the obvious evolution of, well, we know this interacts with this, we can make things in this shape which allows us to do this, and you're just going to end up there because it's a logical progression. Okay, so we've decided that most races, early Titans, probably are not going to be sentient. They're not going to start out truly sentient because they won't have figured that out yet. But used coral and a combination of forged and molded components to make. Effectively, they're going to make duty vehicles, useful vehicles, things and machines, things that are going to help them to do stuff. They're going to be very practical.
That's why I was thinking that the first, explorations in deliberately, directly controlled skeletures would be something like a prosthetic or some kind of exo frame to allow a individual to do more than they physically could do. Prosthetic in the context of the ceratinoids made a lot of sense
Yeah.
because they'll be more likely to be missing bits that they need to temporarily replace, whether by punishment or just by natural incident, because they're a little more laissez-faire with health and safety when they know that they can take the punishment and regrow the limb. But I mean, the real fascinating concept is I can understand how the ceratinoids came to possess Titans. I can understand how the more noodly fish, eel, snake people did. The whales.
So I've got some thoughts on that.
The thought, before you get to that, the thought that's crossing my mind would be that their initial approaches to technologies that would culminate in Titan were basically ways to lash together multiple of their symbiotic, hands, the lesser species that are their limbs.
The Susella, yeah.
Yeah, basically the technologies that go into Titan control were prototyped really to allow greater coordination between those little guys so that instead of the sum of their some of all of their little physical capabilities, they can be working in a mechanical sense that multiplies their capacity to do stuff. Basically, turning them into a block and tackle pulley system in and of themselves without needing external machinery and without trying to just hoist stuff by their own, if that makes any kind of sense.
It does. The thought I'd had with the whale people is, and it also, we have to remember that the shark people are also part of this group. What is unique and interesting about them is that the corals that are needed to create personalities and truly wake up a titan and make it an actual titan that has its own, a paragon titan, I think, is what we'll probably go with the sentient ones, because they're all going to be titans with the way that they work. They're all mecha, but the ones with personalities are probably going to be paragon titans. We'll have to find some differentiation. That's just me putting that thought forward at the moment. The corals that allow for personality to happen only grow where that species exists. And so my thought was that for them, perhaps those unique corals that grow around them, they initially started cultivating to give baby Susella somewhere to live with like a personality to gel onto until babies are born for them to then actually bond with as, the limbs for that baby. So they figured out how to make, a personality or a cluster of this coral type because it services their symbiotes. And then that once, you've got the other species making contact with the Solasians, that's when you then have the ability to have all of the technologies you need to make a true awakened titan.
Yeah. And I agree with Tired German and Archon Eriker here that no, we shouldn't give the ceratinoids every advancement. Crab people are fun, but they shouldn't be the only ones. Which is part of why I'm speculating on what technological tools would the whale and shark folk need, and the idea that they would be the ones to pioneer. The crabs will have developed skeletal structures, perhaps
The
rigid
crabs
skeletal
will have
structures.
developed stuff that they directly link with. The Solasians will
Yeah.
have reason to have things that they can remotely link with.
The other thing is, I could see them being the ones to develop basically the settings equivalent of myomers. They would be the ones to develop the soft tissue materials that provide a lot of the mechanical forces to the hard structure, because that's what they would need, is something that is less rigid, more flexible, and capable of being utilized by a communal Shoal, a communal, what would be the word? A pod? A flotilla?
A pod. Definitely a pod. A pod, a flotilla, no, it's a pod. That's the name of it.
Yeah,
Let me
no,
collect-
that makes the most sense.
A school, if you want to talk about fish. I mean, a school of fish or a pod of whales.
Yeah.
Unlike a parliament of owls.
I've heard them called a wisdom of owls before, which, having, seen what owls are like, there's no such thing as a wisdom of owls.
Or a
No.
mafia of ferrets.
A mafia of ferrets
This-
I can believe in.
This is why we call it a parliament.
Yes, a parliament of
There is
owls
a-
works much better.
Yes, like an unkindness of crows.
Or a murder.
A murder of crows, and a murder of ravens, or an unkindness of crows.
Okay, so...
Does that mean you have a mild grump of magpies?
No, you have a missing wallet. That's different.
Cargo hold.
Valid.
Aquaculture.
I'm going on a limb here and say that the separate technologies developed in parallel to solve different problems, but they mesh together relatively early because it's too useful to be left alone. It's like no one has a monopoly on being smart in all these people and races
Correct.
and species. So once I assume that's very early on long distance travel, being it as unrestricted as it is,
Hmm.
and three-dimensional, making it even less restricted, um, means that knowledge spreads early and fast.
Yes.
And everyone, and unless we're talking with extreme religious fanatics, they will try to gain every advantage as early as they can.
Yes.
Um, which in turn gives us a very strong. What am I trying to say? The cohesiveness of technology will come into being very early, and so there won't be unified uh, tech, but the major leaps and bounds will be available to everyone relatively early on.
Yes. And I think
Not
that makes
some,
a lot of sense for where we want to go with this setting.
yeah. Um,
Honestly, the big limitation to the spread of technology would be hazards of travel, so leviathans and other natural predators and the like, but also cultural conflicts and warfare, because then you don't want to share your secrets and advantages with the guy that is currently actively trying to use them against you.
Yeah,
But at
we
the
did
same
say
time,
that combat titans, this is something we discussed last week. Combat titans came into existence because of leviathans, not because of internal conflict. I
yeah,
did mention in one of the things I read today to you guys when I was going over technology, I did put in a little bit in the forging section about what I've called the Great Gloam War. I think it will
yes.
make sense that once the Serapnoids get to grips with, you know, normal forging as we as humans understand it, that there's going to be an imbalance in power for a brief time. And I think that will be sort of like our big war on Shoal because of that. And that war needs to happen to allow things to even out and for us to have the cooperative Shoal that we're envisioning in the modern day. How do you guys
Okay.
feel about that? That's probably going to have to be the last thing we discuss this week because we are about to hit the end of my time slot and I don't want to run over by too long because otherwise Tex will send me to work in the mines and that will be terrible.
I mean, I'm personally a fan. As much as we have a lot of the um entreaties to the better angels of civilization in how things come together to make Titans possible. At the same time, we're not trying to do the Roddenberry utopia, just like we're not trying to do the grim
That's
dark
true.
future.
That's true.
Civilizations come into conflict,
They
even
do.
if it's for stuff like, hey, you fuckers kept stealing my cattle, and that's a problem. I'm gonna do something about it. Or, resource rights, territory, or just societal pressures. Hey, our primary aquaculture grounds are no longer producing like they need to. Um, well, our options are starve, move, or adapt.
Hmm.
And adapting can be hard. Moving into your next door neighbor's house, kicking them out, and taking their shit might be the only viable solution. So yeah, no, having conflict and warfare
Yeah.
makes sense, even pre-Titan.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, one big war where there was this
Yeah,
huge shift in the balance. Of course, there's going to be other skirmishes and conflicts
yeah.
and interpersonal drama and inter-country drama and all of that. That's all going to be a thing. But I felt like with the birth of forging as we know it would be a big enough upset that that was probably a
I
great war.
I would suggest the amalgamation of two different technologies to make this war possible. One would be the ability to either the domestication of some beast or a communications technology allowing for the marshaling and creating a society capable of waging war on a much larger scale. And the time it took between one society figured it out and other societies figured it out around them was that point where you had war on many, many fronts.
I mean, that.
Imagine,
Go on. Sorry.
yeah,
Keep going.
no, I
Right, here's what we're going to do. Next week, we are going to figure out the entirety of the Great Glome War, and then we're going to use that to springboard us into just talking about general culture and a review of our races. How does that sound?
Great Glome War sounds like what happens when industrialization occurred and you get the first conflict that uses industrial
I did say I wanted to tie it
material
to
production.
the forging, so yes, I had thought about that. All right, we will do that then. Psionic amplification tech, all of that next week. Bring all of those ideas next week, and we will figure that out, and that should springboard us into race review and beginning to really look at some culture ideas. That is what we will do. Do you guys, before I leave, would you guys like a sneak peek of some of the things that I've done for WBPLW this week?
yes.
It's horrible. It's terrible.
Oh no.
I don't believe you.
I made a sequel to Wrestling Star.
Oh boy.
Okay, now I do believe you.
All right, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a graphic I've made for this week's WBPLW sponsor. I will play the song. You guys will tell me if it's too loud or too quiet. And then when that's done, we're going to be out of here, okay? So let me mute Discord. Let me mute me. And then I'll put these things on.
I will not be.
There's a flame that fills the game, you're slamming justice in the ring. Glitter balls and double drops, friendship never ever stops. The chin's got names on lock, Mochi lectures, punches, break the clock. Moon twirls a sparkly grace. He's got a beard, but who's to say? All cosmic suplex love, we're dropping truth from up above. Magical throws and steals your dreams. Fighting fate as a tag team of memes. We're stars falling fast, rising strong. In the ring is where we all belong. No one unite, we shine so bright. With the Kai and the slam, we fight. High fives fueled by friendship, fire. Kawaii rage that won't retire. Ribbons fly and robots spin. We always lose, then somehow win. We trained on a moon made of jelly beans. Hide in the rain while lifting for protein machines. This is our dream, our glittery fate. One choke slam away from a magical state. Our cosmic suplex love, our hearts explode with every shove. No rules safe, no rules too tight. One was all wrong into what's right. We're stars of this weird anime, fighting bad guys and crippling cliche. No one attack, no holding back. Let's sparkle pile drive this track.
There you go, chat. That is the latest horror. I don't know if Elicta and Aiden heard that, but yeah, there you go. That is what is to come.
I turned on the volume on Twitch so I could listen, and it is appropriately why.
Where can we download horror? DM me and I will send it to you. And you can also own Cosmic Suplex Love.
a track from the Apocalypse Jim Jug Band.
That sounds amazing. We should absolutely look into doing that. I'm quite happy to introduce more people to the horrible, horrible tools I use to make cognito hazards. But yes, we now have a theme for Team Moowoon, and I hope to see you all on Sunday for WBPLW. I know we've got some special stuff going on. I've seen the card for this week. It should be really good. And yeah, I will catch you guys at week's end. Thank you for all your ideas, and thank you to Aiden and Lichter for joining me as usual.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. It's fun.
I do very much enjoy doing this, and that so many people choose to toodle along each week to listen to my nonsense. I haven't heard anything, so I'm assuming that we will have Tex and Dep at hour as usual. So, grab yourselves a drink, settle in, have a wonderful weekend, and I will catch you all on Sunday.
Bracing for Teppendex.